I'm going to tell you about the morning of August 13th, 2023, the morning I stepped out into my apple orchard at 5 a.m., as I had every day for the past 40 years and saw things that should never have been there. Leaves, dry leaves, leaves curling at the edges, their deep green fading into a pale yellow from the stem outward. The color any apple grower who has lived long enough with their trees recognizes instantly. The way they recognize their own child's face. The color of thirst. I stopped in the third row from the east, the Honeycrisp row planted in 1997, the trees I put into the ground when my son Daniel was born, the trees that grew alongside him and now stand nearly 8 inches taller than I do, and placed my hand against the bark, the familiar cracked surface warm with Oregon clay in the August morning. Ha! But the soil beneath my feet wasn't right. Dry? Drier than it should have been after just 3 days without watering. I followed the irrigation line. Black plastic tubing ran along the ground between the rows. 16 lines for 16 rows, each line feeding 20 small emitters set into the soil beside each tree. This was the drip irrigation system I designed and installed myself in 2004 after reading everything I could about water-efficient farming. The system ran from a main line connected to the pump station at the head of the orchard, and the pump station drew water from the aquifer, the only viable groundwater source in this land, the one my father discovered and secured water rights to back in 1958. I walked to the pump station. The main valve was closed. Not closed. The way a valve shuts naturally when pressure shifts or when there's a minor technical issue. This valve had been turned by hand, by the red wheel I use twice a year to check the mechanism, and it was in the fully closed position. The small lock I usually attach when it isn't in use had been removed. I stood there in the early Oregon morning, birds singing in the oak trees along the edge of the orchard, the air carrying the scent of soil and dew-wet grass, and faintly in the distance the smell of ripening apples. That soft sweetness I wait for every summer, like someone waiting for a loved one to come home. And I felt something that 40 years of farming had taught me to recognize. This wasn't an accident. No one comes here by mistake and turns off the main valve. Someone had done this on purpose. I turned the valve back on. He has heard the water surge into the lines, the system coming back to life. I walked the rows, checking each tree, watching the color of the leaves, assessing the level of heat stress the trees had endured. With more than 40 years of experience growing apples, I estimated the valve had been shut for somewhere between 60 and 72 hours, 2 to 3 days. Enough to cause significant stress during an Oregon summer, but not enough to kill the trees. This time, I sat down on the small wooden chair I keep at the far end of the orchard for my morning coffee, the one that overlooks the entire field, the distant Coast Range mountains. The view I've looked at every morning for 40 years without ever growing tired of it. I sat and thought, I'm 74 years old, and I've lived long enough and seen enough to know that there are moments in life when you have to make an important decision, not with emotion, but with the cold clarity of someone looking straight at the truth. The truth was this: someone wanted my orchard to dry out and die. And the only person with both the motive and the opportunity to do it was my son-in-law, Kyle Marchetti, who had come to me 3 times in the past 6 months with offers to buy this 120-acre property at prices that were each significantly below market value. And each time I refused, his reasons for pressuring me to sell escalated another step. I looked out over the rows of apple trees in the Oregon dawn, the trees my father planted first, the ones I continued planting, the ones Daniel grew up among, the ones my granddaughter Amy now, every summer, is learning to recognize when they're ripe enough to pick. These trees are not an investment. They are living memories. And someone had deliberately made them thirsty. I drained the last of my cold coffee, stood up, brushed the dirt from my knees. And I began to think about what Kyle Marchetti didn't know. That among all the cards he thought he was holding, he had forgotten the most important one. A card that wasn't his? Never had been. and never would be. The water source. My name is Arthur Dale Pearson. I was born on February 21st, 1949, in McMinnville, Oregon, a small town in the Willamette Valley where the soil is fertile, the rain is generous, and the summers are short but warm enough to grow apples better than anywhere else I've ever tasted. My father, Harold Pearson, bought this 120-acre property in 1945 after returning from World War II with a partially disabled left leg and a determination to own his own land. He paid $12,000, savings from his army pay and a small loan from his brother. For a piece of land he surveyed alone for 3 days before making his decision. I don't know everything he thought about during those 3 days, but I do know one thing he found. About 50 feet down in the northeastern part of the property, there was a groundwater vein flowing through a layer of porous sandstone, and its yield was enough to supply a large farm year-round. In 1946, my father hired a well drilling company to tap into that aquifer, and in 1948, he registered with the Oregon Water Resources Authority a senior water right to that groundwater source. It was a first in time, first in right priority under Western U.S. water law. The earliest claimant holds the highest priority to use the water, and later claimants cannot draw from it if doing so would impair the senior right holder's access. What my father didn't know, what both of us only came to understand gradually over decades, was that this aquifer didn't run only beneath our land. It was the only viable water source across roughly 3,000 surrounding acres, a region where unique geology, a layer of old basalt covering most of the area, prevented other aquifers from forming, which meant anyone who wanted a reliable water supply in this region had no choice but to buy water from us. My father planted the first rows of apple trees in 1946, using saplings from a nursery in Salem. He started with 50 acres of apples and used the remaining 50 acres for dairy cattle, a common mixed farm model in Oregon at the time. When I was born in 1949, those first apple trees were 3 years old and just beginning to produce their first small harvest. My father used to tell me that when I was 3 months old, he placed me in a wooden apple picking crate, the kind that carries the scent of both wood and fruit, and took a photograph that still hangs in my living room today. Baby Arthur, tiny, lying among red apples, eyes wide open, staring up. I grew up in that orchard in the most literal sense of the phrase. I knew how to pick apples before I knew how to read. I learned to recognize apple diseases before I learned multiplication. I could distinguish 32 varieties of apples by smell before I turned 12. The soil of an Oregon orchard, dark brown mixed with streaks of red clay, carrying the distinct scent of humus and decaying leaves, is the first smell I remember, and the one I will remember last. I studied agriculture at Oregon State University, graduating in 1971 with a degree in soil science and crop systems. Not because anyone forced me, but because I wanted to understand the science behind what my father had done by instinct and experience. I wanted to know why apples from the Willamette Valley taste better than those from Washington in a way I could explain, not just feel. I wanted to understand soil chemistry, the microbiology of the soil, the nutrient cycles of apple trees through the seasons. In 1972, I came home after graduating and began working full-time with my father in the orchard. He was 63 and his war-injured leg was causing more and more problems. He could no longer climb ladders to pick apples, couldn't stand for long on sloped ground. I took over gradually, piece by piece, and my father taught me the things that weren't in any Oregon State textbook. How to read the weather from the way clouds form over the Coast Range, how to tell when the soil is deficient in magnesium just by looking at the color of the leaves, and how to predict the season's yield from the structure of blossoms in March. My father died in 1985 at the age of 76 in the orchard, literally. He collapsed from a stroke one September afternoon while checking nearly ripe apples. My mother found him lying between rows of Brayburn trees, a branch of ripe fruit still in his hand. The doctor said he died almost instantly and without pain. I don't know if that's a comfort, but I do know this. He died exactly where he would have wanted to. He left me the entire 120-acre property, along with a set of legal documents he had carefully stored in a locked file cabinet. The land deed, the original 1945 purchase contract, and, most importantly, the Senior Water Rights Certificate number W4892 from the Oregon Water Resources Department, granted to Harold James Pearson and his lawful heirs, giving unrestricted rights to draw water from the well on this land. Arthur, my father, wrote in a letter he left with those documents, a letter he had written in 1981, when his health first began to decline and he started preparing. This land isn't valuable just because of the apples. It's valuable because of the water. Whoever controls the water controls the future of this land. Never forget that, and never let anyone take that control away from you. I read that letter many times over the years, and each time I understood it on a deeper level. I got married in 1974 to Margaret Collins. I'm an elementary school teacher in McMinnville who came to visit the orchard with her students one autumn day and saw a 25-year-old man explaining to an 8-year-old child why Brayburn apples are orange-red instead of the deep red of Red Delicious. He talked about apples like they were the most important thing in the world, Margaret would later say about the first time she met me. And I thought, a man who cares about something not for profit, but out of genuine love, that's someone you can trust. We had 3 children. Daniel, born in 1977, Claire, born in 1980, and James, born in 1983. Daniel stayed with the orchard. He was the only one of the 3 who shared my love for the land. Claire married and moved to Portland, where she became an engineer. James became a nurse in Seattle. They all love the orchard in the way people love a place they grew up in, deeply but without tying their lives to it. That I accepted and respected. Claire got married in 2007. Her husband was Kyle Marchetti, a 34-year-old man, tall, good-looking, articulate about business and investment, with the kind of confidence that comes from being used to persuading others. The first time I met him at a family dinner, I listened to him speak and recognized something Margaret did too. We never said it out loud, but we both felt it. That Kyle Marchetti was the kind of man who looks at anything and sees an opportunity to exploit it, not a value to preserve. But Claire loved him. And Margaret and I were not the kind of parents who interfere in our children's marriages. So we waited and watched. And in those early years, Kyle didn't do anything particularly alarming. He built his own real estate development company in Portland, seemed to do well, and treated Claire and their only daughter, Amy, born in 2009, well. Amy is my granddaughter, a brown-haired, blue-eyed child who laughs loudly and runs through the orchard with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from not yet knowing what worry is. Margaret died of ovarian cancer in 2018, after 2 years of fighting the disease with the calm strength and grace that defined her. During those 2 years, Kyle showed up less and less at family gatherings. He was busy, he had new projects, he needed to travel to Seattle or San Francisco. Claire understood and didn't complain much, but I looked into my daughter's eyes and saw something weakening year by year. After Margaret passed, Kyle began to change. Yeah, not suddenly, but in the way of someone who has been patiently waiting for something and now believes there's no longer any reason to be patient. In June 2021, 3 years after Margaret passed, Kyle Marchetti came to see me at the orchard with a stack of documents and a large, full-color map printed on a zero paper. He spread it across the wooden table in the barn and pointed at it with the enthusiasm of someone who had spent weeks preparing a presentation. The map showed an area of roughly 2,500 acres with my orchard as part of it. Surrounding my land were parcels owned by various neighbors, farmers, orchard owners, a few retirees no longer actively working their land. Most of those parcels were shaded blue on Kyle's map, with small notes. memorandum signed, in negotiation, confirmed to sell. My land, 120 acres at the center, uncolored, was labeled key, essential. Dad Arthur, Kyle said. He'd called me Dad ever since he married Claire, and a title I'd never been fully comfortable with, though I had no proper reason to object. You're looking at the future of this region. I've spent 3 years acquiring or negotiating with the surrounding landowners. This project is a 27-hole golf course and a luxury resort. Marchetti Ridge Golf and Resort. It'll bring hundreds of jobs to the area, millions in local tax revenue, and turn the Willamette Valley into a world-class destination. He paused for effect. The only issue is your land. It sits right in the middle of the project. Without it, the project doesn't work. And? I asked. And I want to buy your land, he said. I'm offering $2.5 million. That's above current appraised value. I looked at the map, looked at the number, looked at the blue parcels surrounding mine on 3 sides. Yet Kyle had spent 3 years buying up the land around me without saying a word. That was something worth noting, not because it was illegal, but because it had told me how he operated. $2.5 million, I said, my voice giving nothing away. For 120 acres of a working apple orchard with 75 years of history and a well with senior water rights. It's a fair price, Kyle said. In fact, it's a good one. Agricultural land here doesn't go for much more than that. No, I said. Kyle looked at me, the look of someone not used to hearing that word. Don't you want to hear more about the project? You might change your mind once you understand the full vision. No, I said again. I'm not selling this land. Not for that price. Not for any price. This land stays in the Pearson family. Kyle rolled up the map. And he stayed polite, shook my hand on the way out, said he understood but would leave the offer open. I watched his car drive out of the orchard gate and knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. I called Daniel that same day and told him everything. He was quiet for a moment, then asked, Are you worried? I said no. I was worried about Claire, about what this might do to her marriage, but not about the land. The land could protect itself if I understood it well enough to do the right thing. 6 months passed. Kyle didn't reach out again. I focused on the harvest. 2021 was a strong year, and the Honeycrisps were especially good after a summer that was just warm enough with evenly spaced rain. Daniel and I worked side by side as we always did, the orchard filled with the scent of ripe apples and dew-soaked soil in the mornings. But in January 2022, Kyle returned. This time there was no map. Just 2 men he introduced as investment partners, and a set of pre-printed contracts. The offer was $3 million. I turned it down faster than the first time. Kyle began mentioning things I couldn't quite tell were threats or simply information. That the surrounding land was changing, that former neighbors had already sold, and development would proceed whether I sold or not. That once construction began, heavy equipment and trucks would use the shared access road I'd once shared with those neighbors, bringing dust and noise. That the value of my orchard could drop significantly once it was surrounded by a resort development. Not direct threats, just market realities. Kyle, I said as the meeting ended, I understand you're doing business and you need this land, but you need to understand something I'm only going to say once. This land is never for sale, not because I'm stubborn or difficult, but because it's something I promised my father and myself 40 years ago. No amount of money will change that. Kyle looked at me with an expression I had seen only once before. The first time I met him, in that brief fraction of a second, when he heard someone say, no, and his face shifted before settling back into composure. It wasn't anger, it was calculation. In June 2022, Kyle met me for the 3rd time. This time, he came alone. No documents, no maps. He simply sat at my kitchen table with the coffee I poured him and said, Dad, I need you to understand that this project has gone too far to stop. I've invested over $15 million. dollars. There are partners, investors. If your land is the only obstacle, I'll have to find another way to deal with it. I don't want that to cause problems for the family. Problems for the family. That was the first time he used those words that way. Not as a threat against the family, but as a suggestion that my refusal was what would create the problem, not his actions. I picked up my coffee, took a sip, and looked out the kitchen window at the orchard in the afternoon sun. Then I said, Kyle, I love my daughter, and I love Amy, but I will not sell this land under any circumstances. If that causes problems for the family, then the source of that problem isn't me. Kyle set his cup down, stood up, and left without another word. And in August 2023, the water valve to my orchard was shut off. After the morning I discovered the valve had been closed, I did 3 things in order. First, I installed inexpensive surveillance cameras at the pump station and at 3 other points in the orchard. Not because I needed evidence immediately, but because if this happened once, it would happen again, and next time I would need footage. Second, I called my lawyer, Franklin Hayes in McMinnville, the man who had handled all our family's legal matters since my father was alive. Franklin was 81, retired, and had handed the firm over to his son, but he was still the person I went to when I needed real advice. I told him about the 3 meetings with Kyle, about the shut valve, and about my concerns. He listened without interrupting, then said something I needed to hear. Arthur, I need my son to review your entire water rights file today. Third, I went out to the orchard and did the day's work as usual, because the orchard needed me no matter what else was happening. Franklin Hayes Jr., Franklin's son who had taken over the practice, called me back 4 hours later. There was something in his voice I recognized as a lawyer's excitement at seeing a clear case. Mr. Pearson, I've just finished reviewing all of your water rights documents, and I think you'll want to come into the office so we can discuss what I've found in person. I went to Franklin Jr.'s office that afternoon. He spread out copies of the W4892 water rights certificate and a geological map of the region he had pulled from the public database of the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries. Do you know your aquifer isn't just a typical farm water source? Franklin Jr. asked. I know it's the only one in the area, I said. My father told me that. It's more than that, Franklin Jr. said. I reviewed the latest geological report for this region, updated in 2019 when there was a proposal for commercial water extraction that was later withdrawn. Your aquifer is a closed hydrological system. It sits in a pocket of porous sandstone completely sealed by an outer layer of impermeable basalt. No other water flows in or out of that system except within the area of your land. I nodded, waiting for him to continue. That means, Franklin Jr. said, his voice clear and firm, any project within roughly a 3-kilometer radius of your land that requires a significant water supply has to buy water from you. There are no alternatives, no replacement wells, no municipal supply close enough, and no project like a golf course and resort can operate without a stable, substantial water source. Which means Kyle's golf project, I began. Which means Mr. Marchetti's golf project depends entirely on the water from your well, Franklin Jr. said. And your senior water right, dating back to 1948, means you have full control over that source. You are under no obligation to sell water to anyone. And you are under no obligation to allow anyone to drill new wells on or near your land. I sat there for a moment, looking at the geological map, looking at the water rights certificate. Franklin, I said, does Kyle know this? Franklin Jr. shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. If his due diligence team did their job thoroughly, they would have identified the water supply issue. But projects like this often get investor money before full due diligence is completed. That's not uncommon in real estate development when people get overconfident. They may know and think they can work around it, or they may not know and will find out too late. Either way, you're holding the key card. I thanked Franklin Jr. and drove home in the late afternoon. The sun setting behind the coast range, golden orange light spilling through the windshield. I thought about my father and the letter he wrote in 1981. Whoever controls the water controls the future of this land. He knew. He had known since 1948 when he secured the water rights. And he kept them. Not because he needed to use all that water, but because he understood that one day, yes, that right would be the most important thing this land had. The next day, I checked the camera system again. On the night of August 21st, 8 days after I first discovered the valve had been shut, the cameras captured a figure approaching the pump station at 2:20 a.m. The person wore dark clothing, but the build and the way they moved were enough for me to recognize one thing. It wasn't Kyle himself. It was someone else. Someone he had hired. This time, they didn't just shut the valve. They removed part of the pump's electronic control unit, disabling the system's ability to automatically restart. I had it repaired the next day by calling in a pump service company. And I called Franklin Jr. to have him begin preparing a file. Not to file a lawsuit immediately, but to have everything ready when the time came. At the same time, and I started researching the Marchetti Ridge Golf and Resort project more closely, not through Kyle, but through public records. Construction permit filings with Yamhill County, corporate registrations, news articles about the investors, and most importantly, the water use permit application Kyle had filed with the Oregon Water Resources Department. Franklin Jr. found that filing, and what we saw made both of us fall silent for a moment as we read it. Kyle Marchetti had applied for a permit to drill a new well, one he claimed lay outside the influence of mine. But the geological report attached to the application, prepared by a private firm Kyle had hired, contained critical errors in its analysis of the region's hydrology, and it had overlooked the exact issue identified in the state report from 2019. The closed system and the direct connection between the proposed well and my aquifer. If Kyle drills a new well under this plan, Franklin Jr. said, he'll be drawing directly from the same source as your well. That violates your senior water rights. The Oregon Water Resources Department has legal grounds to deny the permit. And if you file a formal objection with solid evidence, there's a strong chance they will. I nodded. Do it. But we need time to build a strong case file, Franklin Jr. said. And during that time, Kyle may keep targeting your orchard. I know, I said. Prepare it properly. I'll handle the orchard. In September the 2023, my orchard cameras recorded 2 more intrusions. The first was someone pouring an unknown substance into a small backup water tank I used to irrigate the rows near the barn. The second was that same person returning to remove additional components from the control system. Each time, I discovered and repaired the damage the following morning, but the cost and the lost time were adding up. After the second incident, I called the Yamhill County Sheriff's Office. They came, reviewed the footage, filed a report, and said they would investigate, but made no specific promises. There wasn't enough evidence to identify the intruder. The lighting was low, the face carefully concealed. Franklin Jr. filed a formal report of property vandalism, establishing a legal record. October 2023 was harvest season. That year, I harvested later than usual because the trees had suffered heat stress from the intermittent water loss, slowing fruit development. Yield dropped by about 15% compared to the previous year. Significant enough to impact my income, but not enough to destroy the operation. Daniel and I worked side by side as we always did, saying little about what was happening. This wasn't the time to worry. This was the time to work. But that October, there was a conversation with Claire I couldn't avoid. She called me one Friday evening, her voice carrying a tension I recognized as tightly controlled. Dad, Kyle told me you're blocking his project. He says he may have to take legal action to resolve the land issue. I don't know what's going on, but I'm worried. And Amy keeps asking why you and Grandpa Kyle don't talk anymore. I sat down in the living room, looking at the photograph of baby Arthur lying in a crate of apples on the wall. Claire, I said, there are some things you don't know that I need to tell you. I told Claire about the 3 meetings with Kyle, about the water valve being shut off, about the camera footage, about the legal filings. No exaggeration, no emotion, just the facts in order. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "Are you sure Kyle had anything to do with the valve?" "Not directly," I said, "but no one else has a reason to do it." "Could you be wrong?" I thought carefully about that. I could be wrong about who's behind it, but I'm not wrong about what happened. The valve was shut. The pump system was sabotaged, and it all happened while Kyle needed me to sell. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Claire didn't say anything more about it, but before she hung up, she said, "Dad, Amy's asking if she can come to the orchard this Christmas." "The orchard will always welcome Amy," I said. "And you, that doesn't change." It was the hardest conversation I've had in 40 years of being a father. Not because it was angry or dramatic, but because it was quiet and sad in the way of conversations where both people know there are no simple answers. During November and December of 2023, I made several important preparations. I hired an independent geological firm, not the one Kyle used, to conduct a full hydrological survey of the area. It cost over $15,000, but I needed a professional report with no conflict of interest. And the results confirmed everything Franklin Jr. and I had suspected with precise technical data. A closed hydrological system, the aquifer's capacity, and a clear conclusion that any new well within a 2-kilometer radius of mine would draw from the same system and violate my senior rights. I sent that report to Franklin Jr. to include in the formal objection filed with the Oregon Water Resources Department. The objection was officially submitted on December 15th, 2023. I also hired a small security company to install a better camera system and upgrade the locks at the pump station. Total added security cost, around $8,000. Not cheap for a retiree living off orchard income, but necessary. And finally, I called Daniel and asked him to move back to the orchard. Not just because I needed help, but because I wanted someone I trusted nearby during this uncertain time. Daniel agreed immediately, bringing his wife and young son to live in the small house at the far end of the orchard that we used to rent out to seasonal workers. In January 2024, Kyle Marchetti showed up at the orchard for the 4th time. This time, he wasn't polite. No coffee, no tone of negotiation. He stood at the gate and said, his voice sharper than usual, "I hear you filed an objection to my water permit with the state. What kind of game are you playing?" "I'm protecting my legal rights," I said calmly. "That's not a game." "You realize this could kill my project? There's $18 million of investor money in it." "I didn't put $18 million into it," I said. "You did that without securing a water source first. That's your business decision, not mine." "You need to rethink this," Kyle said. "You're one man against a corporation. You're 74 years old. You can't win." I looked at him for a moment, thought about my father's letter, thought about that morning in the orchard, feeling dry leaves under my hand. "Kyle," I said, "you don't understand who you're arguing with or what this is about. Go home and talk to your lawyer about my filing. Then we can talk again, if you still want to." He drove away. And I knew that whatever came next would no longer come in the form of negotiations. In February 2024, the Oregon Water Resources Department sent notice that Kyle Marchetti's water permit application was under appeal review following my formal objection. During the appeal, all drilling activity related to the Marchetti Ridge project was suspended. It was an important first step, but I knew the appeals process could take anywhere from 6 to 18 months. More than enough time for Kyle to try something else. And he did. In March 2024, Kyle's legal team filed a civil lawsuit in Yamhill County Court, asking the court to dismiss my objection and allow him to proceed with drilling. Their argument: my senior water rights did not apply to the aquifer at Kyle's proposed site because it was a different location from my well, Franklin Jr. And I knew that argument wouldn't hold up against our independent geological report, but the lawsuit meant legal costs and time for both sides. Kyle was trying to drag things out and wear me down financially. During March and April, I worked on two fronts. First, I contacted several agricultural land conservation organizations in Oregon, specifically the Oregon Farm Bureau and the Oregon Agricultural Trust, and explained my situation. Not to ask for legal help, Franklin Jr. was handling that, but to bring public attention to the case. A 75-year-old orchard threatened by a resort project is the kind of story those organizations care about, and the Oregon Farm Bureau published an article about my situation in their internal bulletin. Second, I conducted my own investigation into the financial state of the Marchetti Ridge project. Yeah, it turned out to be less complicated than I expected. Because the project involved multiple investors, there were filings with the Oregon securities regulators and corporate registration documents that were publicly accessible. I asked an old friend, Tom Harder, who had retired after 30 years as an accountant for farms in the Willamette Valley, to help me review and analyze those records. Tom spent 2 weeks going through everything and came back with a clear picture. The Marchetti Ridge project was under far more financial strain than Kyle had let on. The $18 million from investors, that part was real. But land acquisition and early development costs had already exceeded projections significantly, and the project was dependent on a large mortgage loan from a private investment bank, yet with terms requiring construction to begin before October 1st, 2024. October. That was the deadline. If construction didn't begin by then, the bank could call the loan and demand repayment. A chain reaction Kyle wouldn't be able to handle. And without a permitted well, construction couldn't begin. A golf course cannot operate without water. No serious investor would put more money into a project without a secured water source. Tom set the documents down on the table and looked at me. Arthur, you're holding the key card, and that guy Kyle doesn't even realize it. If you hold your position until October, his project will collapse from the inside without you having to do anything more. Not entirely nothing, I said. I still have to make sure his lawsuit doesn't move fast enough for the court to allow drilling before October. Can Franklin Jr. do that? If we have enough evidence to convince the court to maintain the suspension until the appeal is resolved, then yes, I said. In May 2024, Franklin Jr. filed a motion requesting the court to maintain the drilling suspension until the Oregon Water Resources Department completed its appeal review. The filing included the independent geological report, the full history of my water rights dating back to 1948, and, most importantly, a detailed technical analysis of the closed hydrological system, proving that any new well would impact my senior rights. The Yamhill County Court issued its ruling on June 12, 2024, upholding the suspension. I got the news from Franklin Jr. By phone that morning, while I was out in the orchard checking the trees after the first early season rains. I thanked him, hung up, and stood there for a while among the honeycrisp rows. Beneath the soil, about 20 feet down, my father's aquifer was still flowing. Quiet, steady, unaware of the legal battles unfolding above. Water has no sides. Water simply follows the laws of nature. But the control over that water, the right my father had recognized and secured back in 1948, that was something human beings created to reflect a different truth. Who understood first and who chose to protect it? And that June morning, I understood that truth more clearly than ever. July and August of 2024 were the most tense months. Kyle Marchetti made several desperate moves. His legal team filed an appeal against the suspension order with the Oregon Court of Appeals. They submitted yet another geological report, this time from a third firm, arguing that my aquifer and the one at Kyle's proposed drilling site were separate systems. The report contradicted both Kyle's earlier report and my independent findings, something Franklin Jr. highlighted in court, undermining much of Kyle's credibility. In July, Kyle also tried a completely different approach. He proposed extending municipal water lines from the city of McMinnville to the project site, a $3 million infrastructure effort that would have to be funded by the Marchetti Ridge project itself. Yet the city reviewed the proposal but couldn't respond within the timeframe Kyle needed. Infrastructure approvals in a small county don't move that fast. He tried purchasing water from a farm 15 kilometers away via a temporary pipeline, an idea his own engineers quickly dismissed as impractical and too costly to sustain a golf course. And he continued the attacks on my orchard. In July, there was another intrusion. This time, the person attempted to pour something directly into the well, but the new secured well cap I had installed held. The cameras captured everything. Franklin Jr. filed additional reports with the court for vandalism. In August, Claire called me again. This time, her voice was different, no longer cautious or neutral. Something had shifted. Dad, Kyle isn't talking to me about the project anymore. And I heard from Amy that Grandpa Kyle has been working with lawyers a lot. She asked me why you and him are arguing about water. She paused. Can you tell me everything? Not so I can take sides, but so I understand what I'm in the middle of. So I told her everything, not the shortened version from before, but the full story. From the first meeting in 2021, to the intrusions, to the legal filings, to the financial situation Tom Harder had uncovered. I spoke for over an hour, and Claire listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence. Dad, Claire said finally, do you think Kyle knew from the beginning that the project depended on your water? I think he knew the project needed water and assumed he could either buy my land or find another source, I said. I don't know if he fully understood what my senior water rights meant legally, or maybe he did, and bet that I'd get tired or lonely or old enough to give in. He was wrong, Claire said. Not a question. He was wrong, I confirmed. Another silence. Then Claire said, her voice low and strained, Dad, I don't know what to do with this. You don't have to figure it out right now, I said. This isn't yours to solve. This is between me and Kyle. You just need to know that I love you and I love Amy, and nothing in this changes that. On September 22nd, 2024, the Oregon Water Resources Department issued its official ruling on the appeal, denying Kyle Marchetti's water permit application on the grounds that it violated the senior water rights held by Arthur D. Pearson and his lawful heirs under Certificate W4892, granted in 1948. That ruling, combined with the court's existing suspension, meant Kyle Marchetti could not drill a new well. There was no alternative water source large or stable enough within the remaining 2 weeks before the bank's October deadline. I got the news from Franklin Jr. by phone that afternoon, while sitting alone at my kitchen table. I set the phone down and looked out the window at the orchard in its late season, apples ripening red on the branches in the fading Oregon light. There was no sense of victory, no satisfaction, only something quiet and heavy. The feeling of knowing that what was about to happen next would be painful, not for you, but for someone else, and that the pain couldn't be avoided. On October 1st, year 2024, right on the deadline, the private investment bank called the loan on the Marchetti Ridge Golf and Resort project due to failure to meet the construction start condition. Investors, once notified, began demanding the return of their capital. Kyle Marchetti didn't have the liquidity to repay them. He had poured most of his assets into the project. Marchetti Development LLC filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on October 14, 2024. I learned about it through a local business report, not from Kyle or Claire. I sat in my living room with the paper in my hands, looking at the name Marchetti Development LLC, and thought about Claire, about Amy, and what this would mean for my daughter's family. That was the only thing that truly saddened me in this entire story. The months that followed were a time of watching the consequences unfold, while doing the only thing I could do: keep living. The Chapter 11 bankruptcy of Marchetti Development didn't resolve everything overnight. It was a long and complicated legal process. Investors were filing lawsuits, creditors were lining up. The land Kyle had bought around me, land that once belonged to my neighbors, was now tied up in bankruptcy proceedings, its future uncertain. Kyle Marchetti and Claire separated in November of 2024. Not because of me, not directly, but because Claire had seen enough over those months to understand that the man she married was not the man she thought she knew. I don't know the details of their decision. That's between two adults, and I didn't ask. What I do know is that in November, Claire and Amy moved into a small apartment in Portland, and Amy began asking if she could visit the orchard for Christmas. The orchard will always welcome Amy, I told Claire over the phone, repeating exactly what I had said the month before. And you. That doesn't change. Amy and Claire came to the orchard for 3 days that Christmas in 2024. Daniel and his family were there too. James drove down from Seattle. For the first time in years, the house was full. Children running through the halls, the sound of a fire in the stove, the laughter of adults drinking coffee and talking about things that had nothing to do with land or water or legal battles. Amy, 15 years old, long brown hair, blue eyes like her mother's, loud laugh and unafraid, walked out into the orchard with me on Christmas morning. Oh, a thin layer of snow covered the ground and the bare branches. We walked the rows in silence for a while, our breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Grandpa," Amy asked, "did someone try to ruin your water well?" I looked at her. 15 is old enough to understand things that aren't simple and young enough to ask directly. "Someone tried to damage my water system," I said, "but they didn't succeed." "Because you were prepared?" "Because I was prepared," I confirmed. Amy stood quietly for a moment, placing her hand on a Honeycrisp tree, the very row where I had stood that August morning when I first discovered the valve had been shut. "These trees are alive because you didn't give up," she said. "These trees are alive because they have deep roots," I corrected. "I just make sure they have enough water. Like the rest is up to them." In January 2025, I received a letter from a lawyer representing Kyle Marchetti. The letter proposed negotiating the purchase of my water rights, separate from the land itself, just the rights to the water. It was the final desperate move of a man trying to salvage something from the ruins of his project. I handed the letter to Franklin Jr. to respond. Franklin Jr. wrote back, "The water rights could not be separated from the land under Oregon law and could not be transferred independently. The request was not legally viable and would not be considered." That was the last contact I ever had from Kyle Marchetti. In March 2025, the bankruptcy proceeding for Marchetti Development shifted from Chapter 11 to Chapter 7, full liquidation. The land Kyle had purchased around me was put up for auction to repay creditors. I didn't buy any of it, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't have the money, and I wasn't willing to take on debt without a clear plan for how to use the land. But Daniel had a plan. He and his wife, Sandra, who studied organic agriculture at Oregon State, had been watching the bankruptcy from the beginning. They had been saving for years with the idea of expanding the orchard. When the Marchetti land went up for sale, Daniel and Sandra bought 40 acres bordering the north side of my orchard, at a price significantly below market value because the land was being liquidated and there were few competing buyers in the winter. In the spring of 2025, new rows of apple trees began to be planted on that 40-acre parcel. I stood beside Daniel one April morning as we planted the first row, pink lady apples, and a variety Daniel chose because research showed strong market demand and good compatibility with the Willamette Valley climate. The soil had just been turned, dark and moist, carrying that familiar scent of Oregon spring, the smell I've known since before I could speak. "Dad," Daniel said, pressing the soil gently around the base of a newly planted tree, "do you realize that by the time my son grows up, these trees will be taller than he is?" "I know," I said. "My father told me the same thing when I was young." Daniel looked at me. He was right. He was right about a lot of things, I said. In June 2025, Amy asked to stay at the apple orchard for the entire summer to learn gardening. She was 16, had just finished 10th grade, and was at that stage where kids begin searching for answers about themselves. Not answers about the future. What will I do? But about their origins. Where do I come from? And what does that mean? Claire agreed. She and Amy had settled into their new life after the separation. Claire was back to working full-time at the engineering firm, and Amy was doing well in school. A summer at the orchard with her grandfather, Claire believed, would be good for her. Amy arrived on June 2nd with a large backpack and the enthusiasm of a 16-year-old who didn't yet realize that gardening really meant waking up at 5 in the morning while it was still dark to check soil moisture before sunrise. Cat on her first day, I took her out to the orchard at 5:30 a.m. Amy looked at me in disbelief. "Grandpa, it's not even fully light yet." "Apples don't wait for full daylight," I said. She learned faster than I expected, not in the way of memorizing procedures, but in the way of being naturally curious about why. Why are the edges of this leaf pale yellow instead of the center? Why isn't this tree as big as that one, even though they were planted the same day? Why do you water in the morning instead of the afternoon? I answered each question honestly. Not simplified for a child, but fully explained, because I realized Amy could handle real answers. One afternoon in early July, we were sitting on the wooden bench at the edge of the orchard, the one overlooking the distant coast range, where I had sat on that August morning last year after discovering the valve had been shut. And Amy asked me something I didn't expect. "Grandpa, last year when someone tried to sabotage your water system, were you scared?" I thought about it seriously. I was concerned about the apple trees and the water, but I wasn't afraid, because I knew exactly where I stood. "You mean on your own land?" "Not just that," I said. "I knew what I owned and who had rights to what. That knowledge, knowing precisely what belongs to you and what the law protects, that's something I inherited from your great-grandfather. No one can take that away." Amy looked out across the field. "When did your father learn that?" "When he came back from the war in 1945 and bought this land," I said. "He didn't have much money, and he had an incomplete leg and a lot in his head that the war had left behind. But he had an eye for what others overlooked. He spent 3 days surveying this land before buying it, and what mattered most to him wasn't the soil color or the price. It was the water. He knew that whoever has water has a future." "And now you're the one who has water," Amy said. "And now I'm the one who has water," I confirmed. "And someday, if you want, you will be the one who has water." Amy looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, with the straightforward honesty of a 16-year-old who hasn't yet learned to hide what she thinks, "Grandpa, I think what you're saying isn't just about actual water." "It's not just about water," I said. "That summer, Amy learned more than how to grow apples. She learned how to read contracts. I showed her the family's old legal documents, explained each clause and why some words matter more than others. She learned about water rights and Oregon land law through our evening conversations after dinner. And she learned, most importantly, that land is not something you hold and sell when the price is right. Land is where a family puts down roots, and roots take time. At the end of summer, on a late August afternoon before Amy returned to Portland to prepare for the new school year, we picked apples from the first Honeycrisp row. The same row where I had stood that August morning last year, where I had seen leaves drying out from lack of water. Now those trees were heavy with ripe red fruit. The season was clearly better than the year before. Amy picked a Honeycrisp, polished it on her shirt, and took a bite. Her eyes lit up. "Grandpa, this is the best apple I've ever had." "That's because you helped take care of it," I said. She looked at me, then at the apple in her hand, then out at the long rows of trees stretching across the orchard. "I want to learn more about this," she said. "Can I come back next summer?" "The orchard will always welcome Amy," I said. This morning I woke up at 5, as I do every morning, as I have for 40 years, and walked out to the orchard before sunrise. October in Oregon. The air is cold and clear with that distinct scent of damp earth before dawn. The orchard is at the end of the season. Most of the fruit has been picked, but a few final rows remain, their last apples waiting to reach full color. I am 74, or 75. My birthday in February is coming soon. I don't count age the way people usually do, to compare or to ask whether it's enough. I count in harvests. This is my 43rd harvest on this land. 43 harvests, each one slightly different. Weather, yield, challenges. 43 harvests of waking at 5 in the morning and walking out to check the trees before the coffee has time to cool. This land is still here. Like the orchard is still here. And the water beneath it is still flowing. Quietly, unaware of the stories that unfold above ground. Unaware of legal filings or tense meetings or collapsed plans. Water has no politics. It flows according to gravity and geology. But control of that water, the right my father recognized and protected back in 1948, that is something humans created, and something humans must protect. And protection doesn't come through aggression or hoarding. It comes through understanding and preparation. I think about what happened over the past 2 years, and I realize the most important thing I learned wasn't about Kyle Marchetti or the golf course project or even water rights. The most important thing I'd learned is this. My father prepared me long before I knew I would need to be prepared. In 1948, my father filed for senior water rights, not because he thought that one day his son's son-in-law would try to buy the land to build a golf course. He did it because he was a man who understood that property must be protected by law, not just in practice. He understood that documents are not merely things to store away in a cabinet. They are things you must know you have and understand what they mean. And in 1985, when he knew he didn't have much time left, he wrote a letter and placed the legal files in my hands with complete instructions. Not because he knew what would happen, but because he understood that every important battle is decided by the preparation made before it begins. When Kyle Marchetti shut off my water valve on that August evening in 2023, he thought he was starting a war. But in truth, that war had begun 75 years earlier when Harold James Pearson, a man with an incomplete leg and the clarity of someone who had lived through war, stood on this land for the first time, looked down at the ground, and said, "Water." I didn't win because I was smarter, stronger, or wealthier. I won because I inherited the preparation of those who came before me and was wise enough to understand its value. That isn't always obvious while you're living through it. For many years, my father's legal files were just old papers in a filing cabinet. The W-4892 water rights certificate was simply a document filed in 1948 that I occasionally checked to make sure it was still there. My father's letter was just something I read on a sad day and then put away. Until I needed them. And when I did, they were there. Complete. And not a single page missing. Not a signature absent. Not a date out of place. That is the lesson about preparation I want to pass on to Amy and to anyone listening to the story. The most important things in your life, land, family, the rights you have fought to secure, must be protected not with muscle or noise, but with knowledge, with documentation, and with quiet preparation. Protect them before anyone comes to take them. Protect them by fully understanding what you own and the rights that come with that ownership. As for Kyle Marchetti, he is currently restructuring after bankruptcy. I don't know the details, and I don't ask. That is not the part of the story I choose to keep in my mind. Claire is doing well. The divorce is moving forward. She calls me every week, not about big or complicated matters, but about the small things of daily life. How are the apples this season, Dad? Amy says she wants to study Oregon water rights. What should I read about land before I come visit you next month? Those questions are worth more than anything else. Daniel is expanding the orchard onto 40 new acres. Next spring, we will plant another 500 trees. Sandra is researching organic certification so the orchard can enter the premium market. My youngest grandson, Thomas, 2 years old, was carried out into the orchard and placed among baskets of ripe red apples during the last harvest. I took a photograph and hung it beside the old black and white picture of baby Arthur on the living room wall. 2 photographs, 75 years apart, of the same orchard. I look at them and feel something I don't have the exact words for. Not pride, not satisfaction, but something deeper and more peaceful. Something like the awareness that you are exactly where you belong in a long chain of what came before and what will come after. This morning I stood at the edge of the orchard with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the Coast Range. The first light of the day filtered through the oak trees along the edge and cast golden lines across the ground. The air carried the scent of damp earth, apples still on the branches and pine from the distant forest. Beneath me, 20 feet underground, my father's water source is still flowing. I finished my coffee, set the cup down, and stepped into the orchard to begin a new day. This land will remain in the Pearson family. No one will change that. And no one, no matter how much money they have or how many plans or how much confidence comes from being used to getting their way, no one can change that when the person holding the land understands exactly what they hold and why it matters. My father understood that in 1948. I have understood it for the past 40 years. And Amy, a 16-year-old learning to pick apples, read contracts, and ask difficult questions, I believe she is beginning to understand it too. That is the best thing I can do for the generations that follow. Not to leave behind money, not to leave behind land as mere land, but to leave behind the understanding of what this land truly is and why it must never be lost.